Entry 5.1. I was not prepared for what I found in that tunnel. It stretched for over a mile in the back of what should have been a 3x3 interior of a porta-potty. I had been led there by the flying brain, and what I found still succeeds in surprising me. I planned to come prepared, but there was ultimately little that I thought would be useful. I packed a store-bought survival kit, ropes and flares and whatnot, and a heavy metal snow shovel, the only weapon I really thought would accomplish anything. The eggheads only ever responded to bludgeoning, and even then they only seemed to speed up the hatching process. No way could I have hit one of those brain flies with a bullet, but in a closed space, I suppose I could give one a good thwack. Besides the fundamental impossibility of its existence, the tunnel was wholly unremarkable. A slightly rounded concrete corridor, interrupted only by a squarish, rusty gate. The distant droning escalated as I progressed, and soon enough, the tunnel gave way to what I suppose I can describe as a factory floor. I don't know how long I spent just standing there slack-jawed, my brain fumbling over itself to process everything that I was seeing. Think of everything that comes to mind when you hear machinery. Turning cogs, conveyor belts, churning pistons, whirling fans, mechanisms of every conceivable design, and then some cranking and pumping away in a space so vast that no floor or ceiling or walls could be seen in the distant darkness. Now, imagine somebody threw all that away and hired clowns to remodel. 50 or 60 years of neglect later, you might have something close to the Burton-esque hell that I stumbled into. Everything alternated between cold, grimy steel and a sort of Candyland motif, with vivid striped plumbing and polka-dotted ductwork. I jumped as a shower of sparks flew from an immense robotic arm overhead, its rusted metal casting and tangled red wiring a stark contrast to its Mickey Mouse glove hand. I found myself retreating a few steps into the tunnel as it reached out, joints groaning from neglect, and pulled a tremendous lever with a shiny pink knob, an action inexplicably punctuated by the sound of a quacking duck. Instantly, a checkerboard-looking conveyor belt squealed to life, issuing forth a procession of what may have been dead pigs, though I couldn't see their heads, or even the ragged stumps where any may have been attached. With a ridiculous slide whistle sound, another huge object rose into view, an angular pink and purple funnel the size of a swimming pool. One by one, the mysterious carcasses tumbled off the belt and into that huge trumpet, each followed by a torturous rending sound and a brief but voluminous geyser of thick brown blood. The smell was overpowering. Mesmerized by the spectacle of Willy Wonka Sausage Factory, I nearly fell on my ass as a large object shot over my shoulder. It was a brain fly. It had come up through the tunnel behind me and narrowly dodged my head by a few inches. As my heart cautiously restarted itself, I filed away the knowledge that was still of no obvious concern to the things. Even intruding as I was on what may have been their headquarters, or at least an extension of it. I wasn't sure whether or not that was reassuring. The parasite had banked sharply upward as it left the tunnel, but I could still hear the distinct fluttering of big membranous wings between the whirring, grinding, and occasional goofy honking of the factory. I craned my head, waiting for the irregular crackling of the equipment to illuminate the gloom. Sure enough, I could see hundreds, thousands of glistening pink shapes passing a good 10 to 15 stories overhead, all in the same direction. I followed, A network of catwalks made navigating relatively easy, and I was usually able to keep sight of the concrete walls I'd emerged from. Tunnel entryways were frequent. Brainflies periodically zipping through to join their brothers and sisters above. Even if I lost my way, I was confident that another tunnel might empty back into the real world, and probably in a populated area. They needed bodies, after all. I shuddered, not at the thought, but how casually the thought had come. I was growing too used to this, uncomfortably comfortable. The Susian slaughterhouse offered no shortage of grotesque spectacles. Rivers of meat slush oozed their way along a metallic chute as wide as a city street, putrescent corpses bobbing sluggishly in the current, and sometimes against it. Towering circular saws loomed like macabre Ferris wheels, chewing their way through slabs of solid, fresh meat that could have been fed to the whole town. What living things could even have that much flesh on them? A steady splattering turned out to be a blender the size of a small house. Literally, just a scaled-up household blender. It even had a giant-sized dial, albeit with only one setting: Excite. I supposed you could describe the endless truckloads of live white mice poured into it as excited, in a sense. I passed bubbling lakes of entrails, fermented tanks of gasping fish heads, mountains of broken, bloodied bones. An endless procession of meat hooks ferried a bizarre menagerie of carcasses along the tangled railway system, from skinned cattle to things I doubt you have found in any textbook. They were insect-like forms as big as men, tentacled masses dribbling oddly colored ichor, and something I could only describe as a hairy swordfish. Their cargo was so twisted, it was some time before I even noticed what was wrong with the meat hooks themselves. They had no wheels, just clung to their rails by metallic, spider-like legs, tips tapping along with blinding speed. The further I advanced, the louder the wet, slimy flapping of the alien flock became. More and more streams were converging into a single mass migration, the collective wings nearly drowning out the buzzing, grinding, splattering of the factory. I still wasn't sure what I was looking for, but I knew I was getting closer. Entry 5.2. I had ascended 6 levels from my starting point when I first ran into a non-brainfly form of life. My mind almost tried to brush it off as a rat. At first, a tiny white shape scurrying in my peripheral vision. We both froze when I moved in for a closer look. The odd little being was only a few inches tall, pale and vaguely humanoid, with a large and nearly spherical head. It reminded me strongly of one of the eggheads, but there was little chance this thing had been a human. Where there should have been eyes, there were a pair of gaping, bloody-looking holes, and its mouth was a simple circular hole. In its pale, translucent little hands, it carried a hunk of meat. It didn't look dangerous, but it could have breathed fire for all I knew. I cautiously raised my shovel and took a step back, not wanting to arouse any aggression, and the diminutive little imp jerked into motion. In an instant, it crammed the meat into one of its empty eye holes and took a flying leap off the catwalk, landing with a soft, wet splat on a lower level and scampering off into the darkness. From that point on, the tiny creatures seemed to be everywhere. I'd catch them watching me from around the corner, or busily snatching scraps of food from the conveyor belt. I suppose the rat comparison wasn't that far off. But if the brain flies flew and the little goblin things were only vermin, exactly who or what had the catwalks been constructed for? I'd get my answer soon enough. Entry 5.3. Following the airborne river of winged brains, I was ultimately brought to what seemed at first to be a steel wall, held together by colossal beams and rivets. To either side, it appeared to gradually curve away, the exterior of a rough, circular structure. High above me, the stream of brain flies were pouring through a grated porthole 100 feet wide, gaps just large enough to accommodate their wingspans. I could make out additional portholes to my distant left and right, more slimy flocks streaming in. This had to be it, home base, the mothership. The catwalk continued through a significantly smaller porthole into something like a vast stadium, distant electric lights confirming a circular shape about a mile across. Its floor was solid, polished concrete, while its ceilings were obscured by a torrential storm of living bodies. Dozens of brain flies, streams converging into an open roof of looming concrete tubes in the center of it all. A good 20 stories in height, an eerie green glow poured from the top of the monolithic tower like some doorway to another realm. A wormhole back to whatever obscene universe the things truly called home. A three-dimensional web of suspended pathways encircled it all, intertwining with a network of immense grimy pipes a semi could have driven through. It was all so magnificent, so horrific, I almost didn't realize I was still moving forward, my jaw hanging in dumb fascination, nor did I immediately grasp the significance of a metallic sound from behind me, a sound like a gate being shut. My brain mulled over the thoughts for a few more moments before I wheeled around in a rush of panic. The tunnel was closed off. The soft roar of the brainfly tornado had joined a new sound, not unlike the beating of an alarm bell. Then came the meat. I had the good sense to start moving as soon as the nearest gaping pipe began to shudder and gurgle, trickling a thin stream of red-brown slime for a few moments before finally erupting with a torrent of chunky sludge. All meat and meat juice. A few yards away, another pipe vomited to life. At first, I thought the intention would be to drown me. I didn't doubt for a second there was enough meat in the factory plumbing to fill this place completely, but it was quickly apparent that my demise would not be so simple. The meat seemed to spread out much farther than mere gravity would dictate. Wherever I ran, it seemed to flow directly towards me, winding in streams like a pseudopod of an enormous amoeba. Not my imagination. It was the worst-case scenario, but at this point, far from surprising, I'd already seen movement from the twitching thing that came out of the takeout window. Things that couldn't possibly have been alive, but wriggled frantically, even as they were torn apart and devoured by the increasingly fatter, greasier mouths of my neighbors. A chain of green-tinged sausages rose shakily from a nearby heap like an intoxicated cobra. I gagged a little. Emerging mostly from the outer edges of the chamber, the living flesh was forcing me closer towards the tower, where I would have no choice but to ascend the catwalk. I was probably going to die either way, and it was probably going to be hideous. At least, I might sneak a glimpse at an alien world on my way out. Entry 5.4. By the time I had climbed only 3 levels, I couldn't see any empty floor space below me, only a solid lake of meat, rippling with unnatural life, like a pit of deformed, blood-soaked maggots. I could see pieces beginning to climb after me, questing blindly until it figured out the stairwell or simply creeping snail-like up the side of the tower. A few managed to catch up with me or even cut me off momentarily, but the shovel turned out to be an excellent choice. What I couldn't smash or sever, I heaved over the side. Something like an inside-out penguin toddled up to my feet on the 4th level. One good smack and it crunched wetly into a perfect, comical disc, still wiggling uselessly. Rancid brains burst like spoiled pumpkins under my wrath. A writhing mass of intestines inexplicably squealed and died once I chopped off what it was loosely employing as a head. A giant heap of pinkish slime gave me some momentary trouble on the 6th level, shrugging off one blow after another until I was stricken by an overwhelming chemical stink and brandished one of my flares, hoping it might be flammable. As though it knew exactly what I was thinking, it retreated like a snail into a rusty metal drum it had been lugging around. Though individually pathetic, the meat creatures were persistent and increasingly bizarre. Somewhere on the 8th, possibly 9th level, I turned around to find a big fish head attempting to sneak up behind me, tiptoeing comically on a pair of eerily human female legs. It froze up when I coughed, as though realizing too late that I'd been watching it for 4 or 5 seconds. Some fat white bug, like a woodlouse, tumbled out of the fish's mouth, chittering angrily, and fled on its hind legs before knocking the fish thing over the edge. Huh. Weird. The further I progressed, the weirder the things emerging from the factory plumbing had grown. Things that must have grown and festered far longer in these lightless metal bowels. I could barely liken some of them to any animal or body part. Pustuled yellow tubes looped along like inchworms, and tentacled black blobs floundered like stranded fish in pools of their own yellow-green secretions. I was waging a war against hot dog scraps from Planet X. Entry 5.5. I was beginning to get cocky. No matter how horrendous these meat beasts were, they had a very real weakness. I was increasingly confident I could make it home alive, wondering if perhaps they had only put the world under some hypnotic spell because we were simply too powerful, too dangerous for them to defend against. I was beginning to feel like a hero after all, like I was living one of my video games. That self-important high was cut short on the 15th level, when the first real wrench was thrown into my hit things with a shovel strategy. The thing blocking my path was not made of meat. Not on the outside, at least. It appeared to be made entirely of iron, rugged and nearly black. A torso like a department store mannequin stood atop the jointed, knobby legs, and its single arm terminated at a pair of jagged tongs. Periodically, they clacked shut. The oversized head resembled some sort of huge pot or boiler with a pair of cartoonish painted eyes on it. An orange-yellow glow could be seen through the many cracks and vents. I didn't suspect there was much a shovel could do to this, and it neither backed off or approached. It simply stood there, waiting, daring me to make a move. I could see a dense river of meat bodies surging along the path only 3 feet below, making the same slow spiral towards the tower as I was. Fragile or not, there was no way I could keep their numbers at bay forever. I wondered if I'd be taken alive. A dozen things flashed before my mind. The eggheads, the things I'd seen in PETA propaganda videos. Any one of them could be my fate. "Let's just talk about this, Sonny Mom." The voice snapped me back to reality. if you could call it reality. It had come from in front of me, from the robot cook, or whatever it was. What? It doesn't have to be this way, Missy George. Besides its mangled grasp of pronouns, it spoke English with remarkable clarity. Its voice was soft and feminine, with just a slight metallic quality. I'm sorry, was all I could manage, still dazed. We can put you right back where you belong, little thingadoc. We can even fix you up like the rest. You'll never know. I knew exactly what it was talking about. The brainwashing. As far as I knew, I was making first contact with a non-human intelligence, and I had a billion questions about what they were going to do to us, where they came from, what else was out there in the universe or multiverse or whatever we might be living in. Only one thing actually came out. Fuck yourself. It sighed in a hollow, metallic sigh, a little smoke escaping from the face vent. It seemed to sink a little at my response. If that's how you want it, whatchamawoozle. It rose threateningly on its 3 legs, and I realized that it reminded me of a barbecue grill. In the blink of an eye, its clawed arms shot out and clamped around the handle of my precious shovel, effortlessly tearing it from my grip and dropping it onto the walkway. Shit. It shot out again, and this time it got the back of my neck. It slammed me to the ground, taking apparent care not to choke me just yet, but to merely cause me considerable pain. Its legs clanged noisily as it positioned itself directly over me and planted its metal ass directly on my stomach, pinning me to the ground. Lines of black grease began to roll down the thing's artificial face, sizzling furiously. I screamed weakly through the creature's grasp when a single, tiny droplet met the exposed skin of my arm. It felt like I was being branded. The monster giggled. Tee-hee. It spoke out the laughter like it was reading from a bad script. If its eyes had been real, it would have been looking directly into mine, and if it had lips, I'm sure it would have been smiling. It bent forward, the grease still cascading in a thin curtain, threatening any moment to start raining in hissing streams onto my exposed face. The claw around my neck tightened, finally pinching shut my airway. It was gonna burn my eyes out while it strangled me to death. I let go of the thing's arm to shield my face as best I could, wishing I'd had the foresight to wear heavier grade gloves as I waited for the torrent of boiling grease, the thing's giggling reaching a fever pitch. Hee 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 hee, ha 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 ho ho ho, huh? It stopped. The grease didn't come. Removing my hands from my eyes, I saw that the monster's head had turned away from me. You! It shrieked. I couldn't tell what it was looking at until it unexpectedly loosened its grip on my neck and lurched to its feet. I could see a small white shape out of the corner of my eye. Oh, gross, gross, gross! It wailed like a child as the rubbery hobgoblin scrambled up its metal body like a boneless gecko lizard. It started to stumble about, trying its best to pick off the teeming pest with a single arm, but they slipped through the claws like jelly. I wasn't sure how long it would be distracted, and I dove for my shovel before teetering painfully to my feet. I could see the smelling legion of meat just one level below. Vile things, vile! They're in my vents! I was almost too fascinated to act. The hobgoblin had pried the lid off that rusty grill head, exposing an oily, blackened little form underneath. It was too tangled and burnt to make out, but I could see various limbs waving frantically to keep the gremlin thing at bay. I raised my shovel, prepared to strike. All at once, the little creatures snapped their heads in my direction, and dropped like flies from the metal thing, falling to the path and scattering out of sight. The girl face, too, turned towards me. Thank you. You have no idea what... I let out a berserker howl and brought down the shovel squarely on that black, twitching body, splattering it with a wet crunching and a deafening bang against the white-hot grill that it rested upon. The metal construct stood still and silent for a few agonizing moments before it finally began to pitch backwards, creaking like a rusty door before banging to the ground, dead or asleep or whatever I'd just done to it. I prodded it a few times before cautiously stepping around it and continuing up. Something didn't want me to reach the top, and I felt pretty good about that. Entry 5.6. The rest of my climb was relatively uneventful, broken only by the odd hot dog squid or scuttling pork ribs. I was a full 23 flights up when I found myself at the last rough level, the top of the tower, the walkway branching out in a perfect wall-to-wall spiderweb. Up close, the sight of the brain flies was more awesome and more hideous than I could have imagined. Bathed in that alien light, the roaring funnel of unearthly life was almost too beautiful to have burst its way through a formed human skull. The death toll they represented must have been staggering. That terrible beauty rather harshly clashed with the figure standing a few feet ahead of me on a raised, rectangular platform, back towards me as it overlooked the tower and appeared to fidget with a large control console. I blinked hard, trying to register its strangely familiar shape. It had no apparent head or neck. Its body only a broad, rounded mass, like a squarish barrel. A pair of dark, mushy limbs extended from its sides. A white object bobbed around on its upper surface. I didn't want to accept what I was looking at. It was too much, even now. It was just so stupid. It was a hamburger in a chef's hat, just like the logo. If I could sneak up on it, I could plunge my mighty blade into its big, stupid bread head. There was no way it could hear me coming above the teeming bugs. I took my first step, my first cautious step, and it whirled around. Damn it! For a long time, we just stared at one another, the rancid-looking beast regarding me with bulging, bloodshot eyes the size of soccer balls, oozing and twitching as it looked me up and down. I didn't know what else to do, what was going to finally break the staring contest. I lowered my shovel and raised my hand in greeting. Hello. The moldering sandwich stood there for a few more moments before those slimy eyeballs rolled in their lidless socket, as if I had just said or done something more ridiculous than the thing's existence. I almost began stammering a follow-up statement when one of those slimy appendages suddenly reached for a huge bright red switch on its console and nonchalantly pressed it. It raised one sludgy beef hand and gave a sort of toodaloo finger wave as its entire platform abruptly plummeted through the floor and disappeared from sight. The elevator shaft sealed off behind it, and moments later, the catwalk began to flood with activity. Entry 5.7. From somewhere on the opposite side of the glowing, frying brain tornado came dozens of new shapes. Meat beings were pouring from some unknown new opening, already looking larger and meaner than any of those oozing rejects I'd been mowing down. I didn't suppose my little gremlin friends were waiting nearby with flamethrowers either. The first thing to reach me was a squiggly, bear-sized yellow mass of soft, tangible limbs rolling along at a seemingly abnormal speed. It looked almost like an octopus until a long neck snaked out from the warty folds, snapping at me like an orange beak. A giant boneless chicken. Why was this my life now? With a surge of contemptuous bloodlust, I hacked mercilessly into the abominable thing long after it had ceased moving, only for something else to whistle just over my head. I spun around in the shredded remnants of the octobird, coming face to face with a featureless doll crotch and a pair of skinny legs, 6 feet high and fused at the hips. I staggered back, foolishly slipping in the scattered chicken guts, and landed flat on my back. The legs terminated in a needle-sharp lance of bone, precariously balanced on the metal mesh of the walkway. They raised one wicked lance in the air again, aiming straight for my eyes, and it was a miracle I put the shovel between us quick enough. The legs seemed to momentarily vanish with the speed of the strike. It took a moment to regain its balance as it bounced off the shovel, the tip of its bone holding up distressingly well. I barely managed to sit upright as it took a stab for my heart, and I scrambled to my feet just in time to deflect a third strike. Enraged, I swung the shovel like a barbarian's axe, and the legs toppled. While they flailed over the guardrail, I could swear to God that I heard them utter a soft, high-pitched, "Uh-oh." From another direction came a throbbing heart the size of a small car, ambling along on its branching veins, an equally gigantic steak knife protruding from its center like a metallic snout. It reared back, raising itself to full height, 8 feet, on its tendrils, and let out a high-pitched, rat-like squeak. Nope. I attempted to flee down another branch of the metal web, but my course was soon interrupted by a clattering, scarecrow-like assemblage of bone shards and flimsy sinew, chattering its many fractured dog-like skulls as it swung a large, saw-toothed jawbone at my stomach. I struck back with my own weapon, its skull splintering even further beyond recognition. My adrenaline was surging, as single-minded as the gore-faced hordes themselves. I demolished one twisted child of Satan's deli after another. I toppled shuffling golems of pork scraps, wailing ghouls of dripping lard, a serpentine mass of fused chicken feet, and even that giant squeaking heart, its arteries dousing me with a geyser of hot blood as it throbbed its last. I was almost disappointed by how easy it had all been. I shouldn't have been. As I stood up in a puddle of mashed viscera, blood, and who knew what else streaming off my face, I heard a mysterious clang echo through the vast space and felt the walkway shudder under my feet. I was followed by another clang. The shaking intensified. Clang! It reminded me rather uncomfortably of the huge, heavy footsteps on the grated floor. 2 guesses what it was. Come on, I dare ya. Entry 5-8. As the stomping grew louder, an even larger figure emerged from the other side of the flying brain tornado, a shape looming 15 feet tall in the dim, flickering green light, like the pressure cooker before it or whatever it was. It had a largely metallic appearance, though at the same time strangely organic. Its spindly, nearly skeletal body didn't seem like it should be heavy enough to rattle the floor so violently, its long, bony feet terminating in thin, sword-like talons. Most of its weight was likely concentrated in its head, immediately recognizable as the shape of a sausage grinder, slowly wavering with each laborious step. A pair of slimy eyeballs, like Burgrr Man's, stared down at me from the sides of the huge contraption, and where there should have been a handle, there was only a black skeletal arm, ending in another of those white cartoonish gloves. Its worst characteristic by far was the way it breathed, a hollow metallic wheeze of increasing speed and intensity, a panting of some starving dog who just caught a whiff of fresh roadkill. It stepped effortlessly from one catwalk to the other, like a spider scrambling in slow motion along the strands of its web. As it drew closer, something unimaginably worse began to happen. The meat, all the meat I had just slaughtered for at least its second time, was beginning to move once again. At once, the mutated horrors around me began to writhe, stumbled, and drug themselves towards the grinder, whose single arm shot out the moment one groping, rolling pile of giblets came within its impressive reach. It lifted the shiny, sticky mass into its filth-caked funnel on top of the grinding head and dropped it straight in. It continued to stomp its way in my general direction, scooping up more monsters and dumping them into its upper orifice until they were nearly spilling out over the side, a churning bathtub full of flesh and innards. The thing was slow, but as I ran from one end of the spider web to the next, I found every possible exit sealed tight, and by now, the meat rising from below had almost reached my level. There was no way out. There was nothing to fight. I could only keep running. I turned to look back at the grinder being, still ponderously and relentlessly pursuing me in a straight line as I was forced to zigzag. It snatched up the last staggering monster, some sort of spider-legged white-pod thing that resembled nothing I really recognized, and dumped it in with the rest. Without slowing down, the monster clenched its own blood-soaked glove and began spinning its entire arm in its socket, around and around and around with a ratchet-like noise, the collected mutants churning and twisting as they were sucked deeper into the grinder. I turned to continue running, but made it only a few more yards before a sickening, flatulent sputtering sound echoed through the chamber. Something thick, warm, and wet slammed into my back. The catwalk dropped away as I was swung through the air and brought to face the grinder man's unblinking gaze. I was being held tight in an enormous pink hand, wavering at the end of a tentacled limb comprised entirely of raw ground meat. It had formed the limb from every waking nightmare I'd spent the last of my energy putting down, and flung it like a lizard tongue to pinpoint accuracy, instantly subduing me from a good 20 meters away. I squirmed and thrashed desperately, but only felt further mired in the dense, tarry muck. The crank arm continued to twist, and more squirming noodles of processed tissue slithered along the length of its makeshift appendage, cocooning me in more layers of raw flesh. I was reminded yet again of a spider. As I sank deeper into that stinking, sloppy mire, I suddenly found myself transfixed by what was directly behind the metallic giant. I could finally see into the tower, into the vortex, down into where those writhing alien hatchers were all going in such a hurry. At first, I was confused. The significance of what I was seeing almost didn't want to register. Bitter, rancid meat juices were beginning to flood my mouth. Tendrils of meat sludge were probing my eyes and nose. My world was going back. It was being smothered to death. but on the inside, I just couldn't stop laughing. Entry 5.9. I awoke the following morning on the floor of my own home, alive. My body was caked with meat gunk, my clothes sticky with blood. Not a dream. What little must have been in my stomach promptly emptied itself onto the carpet. I guess I'd been tearing those up soon, if there was any real point. I staggered to the shower, my mind racing with all I'd seen in the meat factory. They had apparently neither wished to kill me or erase my memories. I guess they knew as well as I did that there was nothing I could do to them. After all, if cattle couldn't do much to change their fate, what hope would there be for the cattle to feed? Entry 6. I tried to get a fountain drink at 7-Eleven, some sort of pinkish gunk coiled out like soft served, smelling like hot bologna. I cut open what I thought was a watermelon. The inside was a lot like a brain. I unwrapped an almond joy and got nothing but a length of bone filled with clear yellowish mush. I put money into a Coke machine. Saw the bottle tumble to the bottom. I reached through the door. I pulled out a heart. It was still beating. I hurled it to the pavement and stomped onto it. Nothing but a red, sticky stain was left. I came home starving, not even surprised by a flock of chickens hobbling around my front lawn, plucked and headless. I staggered to my kitchen and cracked into another box of cereal from my dwindling stash. Cat food stink. Cartoonish hamburger. The words Superior Food Market had replaced Frosted Flakes. Tony the tiger was now a grainy photograph of a bobcat. A box of Lucky Charms now said added tissue rind above a crappy JPEG stock image of a nobody leprechaun. Cheerios had become organism parts added fluids. The rest of the box was dominated by a close-up of a clammy gray intestine. I rummaged through the whole supply in a day. Red blood materials, marvelous food nuggets. None of this was there when I had bought it. I didn't bring home anything with a single letter out of whack. The last box used to be Cocoa Puffs, my favorite. Fred Flintstone still looked like he should, just far too real. I could see every pore on his lifelike fleshy nose. This was now apparently a box of flavored meat substance. Whatever. What the fuck ever. I ate it. I ate it and it was delicious. So was the mysterious can of your flavored meat paste waiting for me on my coffee table. So was the cup of what looked and smelled like liquid bacon straight from my tap. The black thing in the refrigerator was as sweet as maple ham, even if it looked like the bastard child of a caterpillar and a starfish. The best thing by far was the steak. The huge, red, juicy steak ready for me on the front seat of my car. It wasn't even the flavor that made it good. It was the screaming.